This question's from 2006, and it has a couple of user-defined classes. Very likely that you'll see a question like this on your AP exam. So a user-defined class is something that was just made up for this test. This was not in your textbook, wasn't taught to you, wasn't supposed to be taught to you. These kids had to figure it out on the fly, and very likely you'll do the same thing. So they had to figure out, first of all, what is a time interval? Well, not much is revealed to us, but we do see that there's a method in here called overlaps with. This is in the time interval class. So if I have a time interval object, I can call this method on it. To use this method, I would have to give it a time interval. So kind of think of like the string method compared to. You have a string, you compare it to another string. I have a time interval. I want to know if it overlaps with another time interval. It's going to tell me Boolean true if there is an overlap, false if there's not. Okay. And then we have something called an appointment. This is another user-defined class, and it's got a very similar method called conflicts with. I'd have to call this method on an appointment because it's in the appointment class. To use this method, I'd have to give it an appointment. And then it would come back true if there was a conflict, false if there wasn't. So in part A, we have to write this method. And one thing we have to figure out then is that an appointment, again, we don't know much about it, constructors, instance fields, but apparently an appointment has a time interval aspect to it, because if I have an appointment, I can call the method getTime on the appointment, and it will give me back the time interval that belongs to that appointment. So if I started with an appointment, I could get its time interval. If I had another appointment, I could get its time interval, and then I could run my overlaps with method. And that's exactly what we're going to do right here. So if we're writing code inside of the appointment class, the only thing that would bring us to this point is an appointment object, which we could refer to with the word this. And so in part A, we're writing this code inside of the appointment class. Okay, there's this method. The only thing that's going to bring us here is some appointment reference, and that could be called this. Appointments have time intervals. We can get those time intervals by asking for them. So for example, I could make up a time interval and call it A, and I could use the word this, that's the appointment that brought me here, and I could say, get me the time interval that belongs to this object. Now, okay, I've said it 100 times, writing the word this is completely optional. So if you didn't write it here, it'd be fine, okay? And you might not ever want to write it, because remember, if it's a static method, you can't write the word this, so just keep that in mind. Now we have another appointment called other. This appointment came to us as some sort of parameter. So the user of this method had to call it on an appointment. That would be the one referred to as this. And then they had to hand it another appointment. And let's name this time B. Okay, so right now I have two time intervals. One that belongs to the appointment that brought me here. The other one came in as this parameter. Now, why do I want time intervals? Well, remember, there's one thing I know that I can do to a time interval. I can run my overlaps with method on it. And that's really the key to this problem is, does A overlap with B? And if they do, this method would return true, and now I have a conflict. If they don't, it would return false, and I don't have a conflict. And I put in a couple of tester cases just for part A of this problem, so we should be able to see if their code's working so far. And yeah, it looks good. Got false, true, false. You could go read more about the tester cases in my main if you wanted. Okay. So now we should feel good moving on to part B. Part B, daily schedule. Okay, so now we're in a third user-defined class. This class has an array list of appointments. In 2020, this would look a little different. Now it would say array list type appointment. But these kids had to actually cast their objects on the way out. But okay, we don't have to do that. It would be typed for us. So it's a basic remove method. Remove any appointment that has a conflict with this given appointment that comes in as a parameter called APPT. Okay, so we have a method called conflicts with. If we give it an appointment, It will tell us true if there is an overlap, false if there isn't. We have an array list of maybe 100 appointments, maybe 5. We'll have to go through and check all of those appointments in the array list and see if there's a conflict with this given appointment. And if there is, we're going to remove it. So when we write remove methods, remember we did it a few different ways in class. I'll do it differently than I did yesterday. So let's try the backwards loop approach out today. So we'll start at the last valid index of this appointment list. Okay, and that was given as the but that was given as the name of this array list. Okay, APPT list with the capital L. The last valid index, okay, -1. We'll work our way back towards 0, the first valid index. We'll go one at a time. Okay. Do you have to use a backwards loop? No. No. I've showed you several different ways in class to write remove methods. This is one way that we discussed. So what I need to know now is, does the appointment coming out of this list have a conflict with the appointment that was handed to me called APPT? You don't need to write a separate line of code for this, but maybe you want to just go ahead and get an appointment from the appointment list. So .get I. Okay. Does that appointment now that I named A have a conflict with, so conflicts with, the appointment called APPT? We wrote that method in part A. It's very, very important that you don't try to like recreate the code here. If you start using the get time method, like we did in part A, you're going to lose points. You have to use established methods. So we've got to use this method that we wrote in part A, or we're going to lose points in part B. If there is a conflict, I want to go to the appointment list and I want to remove it. Okay, and I remove by index in this class. So if you go look at my tester class, I set up a little appointment list and I put in a couple appointments and then I ran one, and you can read more about it, but again, it looks like it's working. I think I put in like 9 to 12 or something is like the one that has conflicts. So we remove the appointments that conflict with the one that came in as a parameter. All right. And now we'll go to part C. Okay. In part C, we're going to add an appointment. However, not all appointments get added. So this is a Boolean return method. It's going to say true if we do add it, false if we don't. So what's the determining factor? Well, there's actually a few. Some appointments are considered emergencies. So this Boolean emergency variable, if it's true, we got to shove this appointment in no matter what, even if there are conflicts. So if it is an emergency, what we could do is we could clear the conflict, okay, with our method that we just wrote in part B, or maybe conflicts, there might be more than one, and then we'll add it. Anytime we add an appointment, we're going to return true. It's a Boolean return method. Then if it's not an emergency, well, now it becomes sort of a question. Is there a conflict or is there not? So we'll have to write a little bit of code to figure out if there is a conflict with any of the appointments. And then if there are not any conflicts, we'll add the appointment, we'll return true. If there's one single conflict, or 10 or 20, doesn't matter at that point, but then we'll just simply return false. Okay, so there's several different things going on here. Okay, so maybe the first case we'll consider, this might be the easiest one to write, would be, is this an emergency? If it's an emergency, that sort of supersedes everything else, and we just want to clear the conflicts. Okay, so we have a local method that we can call right here. It's a void return method. All we have to do is just call it. And if you call this method, you simply have to feed it one appointment. And we have an appointment handed to us called APPT. So I'm going to call that local method. It's going to work its magic. You absolutely do not want to recreate that code again. Okay, you have to call local methods when they're accessible. And then at this point, I want to return true, and I want to add the appointment. You can do this in 2 lines of code, although if you're really on top of things, you might remember that the add method of the array list class, there's 2 of them. If you use the one where you don't put an index in there, like you just say add it, it actually returns true. It's kind of a weird method. If you didn't remember that, no big deal. Just add it and then return true on the next line of code. The order of the list doesn't matter, apparently. So I couldn't find anything in the directions that said the order of the list matters, so we can just add it to the end or whatever. Okay, well now let's consider our else. So if we make it into the else, we know that it's not an emergency, so we're not even going to consider that. But what we don't know is there a conflict? So I need to figure out, is there a conflict? So maybe what I could do is I'm going to start off under the assumption that there is no conflict anywhere in the list. Then what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at every single appointment in the list. Okay, so I'm going to write an enhanced for each loop. I'm going to say, give me every single appointment from the list. I'll just call it A for short. If any of those appointments, I don't really care which one, but if any of those appointments conflict with this appointment APPT, okay, then I got a conflict. And so I would flip my conflict variable to true. All right. So what do I know now? I know whether or not there's a conflict. Okay. So if there is a conflict, then this is actually pretty easy for me. If there's a conflict, I just simply return true and I'm out of here. Okay. So if there's a conflict, return true, return false. We were unable to add the appointment to this list. Okay. But maybe there's not a conflict. Okay. If there's not a conflict, then I can go ahead and add it. Again, you could do this in like 2 lines of code or 1. So I guess, the easiest way here would be to just add it. Remember, we don't need to like make room for this or anything. Like we're not supposed to like clear the schedule. We only clear the schedule if it's an emergency. We did that earlier. Here, we're saying we only want to add this if there's no conflicts. So you'll see in my tester code, I put a couple of different things in. Let's see what happens. So the first few appointments add just fine, okay? 9 to 10 does not conflict with 11 to 12, does not conflict with 12 to 16, but then 10 to 12 comes along, that conflicts with 11 to 12. So that one was not added to the list, okay? Then I said, well, let's put 10 to 14 in and let's label it an emergency. So what actually happened was it cleared out 11 to 12 and 12 to 16 and then put 10 to 14 in. So you ended up with 9 to 10 and 10 to 14. Okay, and you can play around with the tester case a little bit more. There's obviously other ways you could write this solution, but again, this is a real important problem to practice with. We have to be able to work with user-defined classes. Okay, so they're going to make things up. You're going to have to read about it and figure it out in a fixed amount of time. What that class can do, what that object can do, and then handle the methods of that class. So very good. I'd almost would recommend maybe come back, practice with this problem again, in a couple weeks, because this is a really good problem to practice your object-oriented programming. Okay. And so like I've been telling you, if you don't know, now you know.